Welcome to this new video from Finance Re. My name is Simon Locknane and today we're going to talk about cost allocation using Power BI. So cost allocation basically means taking a central amount of overheads or expenses and we want to spread those over certain categories. So we might want to spread them by product or by department of our business or by store, so that we can get a better idea of the true profitability of a customer or a store. So a very common requirement, and in order to spread those costs we need to choose a driver. So that might be headcount or sales or square footage of an office or factory or personnel costs. All sorts of drivers, and it might be we need to choose a suitable driver to use to allocate certain expenses in our business. Many of you from a finance background will have heard of activity-based costing, which is really what that's all about. So taking central overheads and spreading them to different parts of our business using an appropriate driver. So it's a common requirement, and Power BI is a great tool for doing cost allocation because of the power of the calculation engine. The DAX formulas can get a little bit tricky, a little bit complicated. So in the video today we'll work through an example together. We'll start from the beginning and write some DAX to do some cost allocation, and hopefully that will give you a good idea, certainly how I approach it, and there'll certainly be some other ways that people do it as well. So if you do it slightly differently, then please leave a comment. Okay, so without any more discussion, let's head over to my laptop and we'll work through an example together. So here we are in Power BI Desktop, and I've imported some tables from Microsoft's Contoso database, which is a free example database that Microsoft provide. You can see we've got a very simple data structure. We've got a central sales table, which is our fact table with all of our sales transactions, and then we have 4 dimensions: product, date, store and customer tables, each of which are linked to our sales table. If we look at the sales data, you can see that we've got the order number or the date, and then we've got the key customer, store and product keys, which link to our dimensions. Obviously the order date linking to the date table. Then we've got our price, unit price, the cost, and these are in currency. So we need to, if we want to sum these transactions, we need to do some conversion, and there's an exchange rate that's included. So I've already wrote some simple measures and put together this table to look at the gross profit at a country level. So the sales amount in US dollars, cost of sales, and a gross profit, which is simply sales less cost of sales. I'll quickly show you those measures. So the sales amount, so we're iterating over sum X over sales table, and it's just the quantity times the price converted into US dollars. The cost of sales is exactly the same, but we're using the cost instead of the sales price, and then the gross profit is just the one minus the other. So 3 very simple measures, and I've also brought in as well as the country, I've brought in the store into this matrix. So you can see here we've got, we can expand the matrix to see by store our gross profit. So yeah, this is great, but what we'd also like to do is see our profitability of our stores after an allocation of central overheads. So if I go back to the data model, I've got one more table here off to the side, which is our head office expenses. And this is just, I put together some numbers in Excel. Let me show you those. As you can see by country, so these are all head office expenses, but some of them are directly attributable to a specific country. And then there's a group here just with head office where we have a large balance, which isn't easily attributable to a country, but we need some way of allocating it down to a country and lower level. And in fact, even the expenses that are at a country level, we'd also like to allocate down, because if you remember from the matrix in Power BI, we want to be able to look at the net profit after expenses at the country and also at the store level. So we're going to need a way of allocating down those country level expenses. So a first step, and if I just go back to the data model quickly, so I could create a relationship to this expenses table from the date table based on the year. For this example, and in most cases you would probably want to do that. So where your table with your costs to be allocated can be filtered by common dimensions, it'll simplify the DAX to make those relationships. I think for teaching purposes, I'm going to leave it as a wholly disconnected table. So I think that is probably more helpful. So I'm not going to create the relationship between date and expenses. It would be a many-to-many relationship on the year. So we'd have to be careful that we only enable the filtering one way from date to expenses. Okay, so the first thing we could do, so we could bring in at a country level very easily the expenses. So let's write a measure to do that together. So on the expenses, I'll put this on the expenses table, new measure. Let's call it head office country country level expense. So we want the sum of the head office calculate sum head office expenses. Now we need to, obviously this would just sum all of the rows in our table of expenses, but obviously want to only bring in the correct expenses for each country. So because there's no physical relationship between the tables, I'm going to create a relationship using DAX, and the function we can use to do that is treat as. So I'm going to, let's do the country, and the first parameter needs to be a table, so I'm going to use values, and it's the country, store country. So the values of the store country, and treat as, you can think of it, treat this table, or these values, treat these as a filter for something else, and the row that we want to apply the column that we want to apply the filter on is obviously our head office expenses table country. So we're saying, yeah, treat the store country column and take that and use it as a filter on the expenses country column. Similarly, I didn't create the relationship to the date table, so we should do the same for the year. Treat as values date year, and this will be our head office expenses year. I've only got 2019 in the expenses table, and actually I've got to filter 2019 over these sales numbers, but for good practice we should include that in this measure. Let's just format that measure. And then we can add this to our matrix. And now we can see, so we're bringing in those head office costs that have been, that are directly attributable to a country. But if we expand the rows of this matrix to the store level, you can see that we get the same value for every row. And that makes sense because as far as Power BI is concerned, this country Australia, each of these stores we're in Australia, so the country is Australia, go to our expense table and pick the Australian number, which is 1 million. Power BI doesn't know how we want to allocate these numbers. So we need to write a measure that will spread these numbers over the stores in a sensible way. And that's obviously a business decision, what's the most appropriate way that we want to do that allocation. For this example, we're going to use sales, which seems like a sensible driver to choose. So let's remove this initial measure from our matrix. So let's think about a more complicated measure that will take our expenses and allocate them down to the store level. So going back to our expenses table, I'm going to break the measure up into two parts to keep it simple. So we'll do one initially for these rows that have already been allocated to a country. And then after we've done that, we'll look at the head office expenses that need to be allocated completely. And because this will be a more complicated measure, rather than writing it in Power BI, I'm going to use DAX Studio, which is an external tool that can connect to Power BI. If you're not familiar with DAX Studio, I really recommend you go and look at it. It really helps with all sorts of aspects of Power BI. For developing complex measures, it's great because we can see the results easily of our of different tables that we want to do as we build up our measure, of our interim tables. So you can see here we're connected to our model. Here's our tables. Let me just make this larger. So we know when we're talking about allocations, it's very important to think about the granularity. So the granularity of our expense data, which in this case is country and year. So we know that we're going to have to do our calculations at this grain because there's a different amount to be spread for each country and for each year. So let's start by evaluate. To a variable. I'm going to summarise the sales table. Summarise sales. And so we're going to, like I said, we're going to look at the granularity of country and year. So I'm going to summarise sales store by store country and by year. Let's see what that gives us. Make this larger. So you can see we've got a table. So for each country, so we've got 2 years of transactions in our sales table, 2018 and 2019, and we have that for each country. So you can think of this table as the product of the countries in our sales table and the year. Now, you might be confused, why have I summarised sales by store table and date, so 2 other dimensions? And this is a concept in Power BI called expanded tables, where if we've got a table with the many relationship connected to a table with a one relationship, we can access the columns in the one table are effectively part of the many table. A full explanation is a little bit beyond the scope of this video. It would take too long, but if you're not familiar with the concept of expanded tables, I do suggest you investigate that. For now, we've just accept that we can do that. So we can summarize the sales table using the dimension columns. Okay, so that's our first table. Now we want to add some more columns to this. So I'll do another variable. I'm going to use add columns. I want to add them to the table we just created. And we're using sales as our driver. So we know we're going to need the sales amount. So I'll add a column called sales, and this will just be our sales measure. Now, when this is used in a measure in Power BI, it'll obviously be calculated in the filter context. So the filter context from the visual and any external filters that we're applying. We're obviously going to need the head office expenses. And this will be, this is very similar obviously to the first measure that we wrote. Calculate sum head office expenses and we need to artificially create the filters, and again we'll use the treat as function. Now actually let's do the country first, and we're adding columns to this intermediate table here, remember. So we want to pick up the country in the row and then filter our head office expenses table by that country. So this is context transition. We've got a row context here, and we want to take that and have it applied in a filter context. Now to start with, let me just put country column, and this won't work, but I want to just show the idea. And we're going to use country for our head office expenses country. So remember, treat as, you can think of as treat this country as a filter for this country in the head office expenses table. Okay, I'm just going to, before we do the year, I'm just going to finish that. Let's get my parentheses right. Return, so we want to return this new variable. And we should get an error. Not the error I was expecting. Let's try again. You see here, the treat as function expects a table expression for the first argument. I think I mentioned that before. And here we're just providing the column, the value in the column of the intermediate table. Now we can change this value into a table very simply if we just enclose it in these curly brackets. So this is the notation for a table in Power BI. And let's try that again. Oh. Oh, sorry. This should be obviously not the country, not the sum of the head office expenses. There we are. So you can see now it's brought in for each country. So Australia 1 million, Canada 2 million for each country. You can see we've got 2018 and 2019, which isn't right because our table was just 2019. We might have a table that's got all the years in, but in this case we've just got 2019. So we also need to create a relationship for the year. So again, we're going to treat as, and we're going to do the year. So the year column, but again, we need to provide a table value as the first parameter of treat as. So year, head office expenses, year. calculate add columns. Okay. Great. So now you can see we've returned in the head office expenses for the right year, 2019, and for the right country. So we're not finished yet. So now ignore these blank. We don't need to worry about these 2018 values. When this has been used in a measure, there won't be. If we're filtering on 2019, then obviously these rows wouldn't appear anyway. But because in DAX Studio there's no filter context being applied, we're obviously bringing in all of the years that are in the sales table. Okay, so for the 2019 years, now because we're doing allocation by sales, we've got the sales number, and so this will be the sales number for Australia for 2019. But if we were calculating this at a more detailed grain, so at the store level, then this would actually be the lower number for the store, because it's just the measure. So it will be affected by all the filters in the visual and external filters that are being applied. So this value, we want to divide this. This will be the top of our fraction. And for the denominator, it's actually these, if you like, these totals that need to be our denominator. We can think of this as sorry, not the expenses. It will be the sales will be the denominator at this grain. So we can, if we have the sales for Australia 2019 in total, whatever sales is calculated, say for a store, we need to divide it by the total sales for the country and the year. Let's go back so we can have a new column, still in our add columns formula. That's there, so it'll be here. Sales at cost grain. That's not too complicated. And here, so we're going again, we calculate. So we want sales, so we use our measure again. And this time we don't want any additional filters being applied. We want to make sure that this is the number. Whatever filters are being applied in the visual, we really want to ignore them. We want to make sure that this is the denominator, so this is the larger number. So it needs to be the total for the country and for the year. And we can use a function all except. So we can, any filters we can ignore, except for those, obviously we don't want to ignore filters on the country. We just want filters on the country and the year, nothing else. So all normally ignores all filters. There's two filters we don't want to ignore, so we'll use all except. So it's on the sales table, so we want the whole sales table, but we want to ignore, sorry, we do want filters we don't want to ignore from the store, country, and from the date. Year. Just make sure I get my parentheses correct. There we are, okay. That's right. See if that works. Here we are. So you can see we've got sales and sales at cost grain, and we're getting the same number, which is what we'd expect, because here there isn't any other filter other than Australia and year. They're the filters that the denominator sales, the larger sales, will be as well. But again, if this was a measure and we were at the store level, this would be this would return just the sales for that store, and this would return the sales for Australia 2018. And by dividing one by the other and then multiplying it by the expenses, I should use the 2019 one. So divide the sales by the overall sales for the country and the year, times that by 1,000,000, and that will be our allocation of cost. Okay, so I think we can, I'm going to take this now into Power BI just to finish the measure off. So now we've got this table. So let me copy this. Actually, let's go to, yeah, let me copy this. So let's put a new measure on the expenses. Of course, head office, country, allocated. So here's our variables. We want to return so we're going to iterate over our variable table. We call it add required columns. Just check, so head office expenses times sales over sales at cost grain. Divide sales at cost grain. Actually, before I'm going to take out the multiplying it by the expenses. Let's just see what the proportions that we're getting look like. Okay. Right, so let's try bringing that into our matrix. Okay, so this looks good. So at the country level, we'd obviously want 100% of the country amount. I'll make this a percentage. And then if we were to go down to the store level, this would be our allocation down to the store level. So just to quickly check that. Yeah, so I think that's 100%. So that seems to be working. And the nice thing is that not only will this allocate at the country and at the store level, but if we were to bring in other dimensions, so I'm just going to take out these other measures from the table. If we wanted to bring in or look at an allocation over time, for example, take our date table and bring the month into the columns, you can see that we have our allocation over the year as well. So the costs are being allocated by month. And again, remember, sales is our driver. So it's the sales in that month is what is driving the share of that expense allocation to those months. So we have it by month and month by store. and customer, any other dimension that we want to bring in, we'll get a sensible allocation of expenses down to that level. So really very powerful, something that would be extremely difficult to actually achieve in Excel or in other tools. So yes, so I'm happy with that. So let's just restore our table. So I'll take out the month. And then let's add in, actually I'll just leave it like that. So let's just take our measure. So that was our proportions, and then we need to times that by the actual expenses that we want to allocate. And this won't be a percentage now, just format that. So here's our country level expenses, and here's those expenses then that are spread down to the individual stores. And like I said, we can actually slice this by any dimension, and we'll get a sensible allocation based on sales down to that grain. So we can bring the gross profit back into our visual. I'm not going to bring in the columns before that. So we now have our country level expenses, which will be allocated down by store or customer or month, whichever grain that we want to look at it by. But we still have this head office amount. So this head office, which can't be, isn't to a specific country, which we still need to bring in to get our overall net profits calculation. So I'm going to write this as a separate measure. It'll be very similar to the previous one, although we don't have a country grain because it's just head office. Also, we need to make sure we're only bringing the head office cost. We do have a year granularity, so we do need to think about that. So it'll be quite similar to the previous measure. Let's start with a brand new query, I think. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we need to do the calculation year over year because we still do have a year grain. So let's do a variable. And again, I'm going to summarize the sales table, but this time just by the year. Check that works. Okay, so we've got our 2 years for which we've got sales data. So that's our starting point, and then we need to add the extra columns that we need. Add columns to the years variable. So the first thing we're going to need is the actual head office costs. Let's calculate. So head office expenses. And we only want it where obviously and we don't want all the countries. So head office expenses country equals head office. I think that's right. Let's just see if that works. Something not right? Okay, so we've got 20 million, which is the right number, but we shouldn't have anything for 2018 because our table, sorry, let me make this larger. We shouldn't have anything for 2018 because our table has only got 2019. So we're not here, we've not specified anything about the year. So we need to create the relationship, the artificial relationship using treat as. So I want to treat as the value in the year column as a table. Head office expenses year. There we are. This is the expected result. So 2018, nothing. 2019, 20 million. Okay, good. And again, we're going to use sales again as our driver. So we know we'll need sales. And this will be just our sales amount US dollars. So remember, as before, this will be the sales at grain. So wherever we are in the filter context, within a visual, and the filters being applied elsewhere in Power BI, this will be this amount that's been calculated. And then we need a denominator. And remember, before our denominator was the sales, so at the grain of our costs. So the grain of our expenses was country and year. So the denominator for the offset was sales at the country and year level. Here we don't, for the head office row, there's no country that we need, but we do need sales just for 20. We do need to bring the year into our denominator sales. So let's add. Actually, before I do that, let's just check that sales calculation is right. Sales at year grain. Calculate. We can use our measure, sales amount US dollars. Again, we want to, so any filters we want to ignore. So all would ignore all filters, but we do need to keep the filter from the year, of the year from the date table. All except sales. We want to remove filters from the sales table apart from date, year. Okay, let's see if that works. Yep. Again, because we're in DAX Studio, there's no filter context, so we get the same number for sales and sales at the year grain. But if this was in a measure, this would be filtered down by the filters, so it would be a lower number. Great, so I think that's all we need now. We can then bring this into a SumX and sales over sales at year grain will give us our proportion times the head office expenses will give us our value. So I'll copy this. Back to Power BI. New measure on the expenses table. Let's call this no country head office expense. So to finish this off, I want to return sum x over this table, add required columns, and it's the head office expenses times divide sales at year grain. Just format that, and then let's bring this into our matrix. There we are. So 20 million in total, and this is it allocated by country based on sales. So we're splitting it down to country, and again, if we choose a store, let's choose Netherlands this time, we can see the Netherlands amount split by store. And again, this will work by date, by customer, any of the other dimensions that we want to filter by. So that's all the hard work done, all the cost allocation. I suppose we should add one more measure just to finish off. I'll add this on the sales table, which will be our net profit. So net profit, US dollars. And this is just going to be the gross profit minus the head office country and the overall head office costs. So we can see we're not very profitable this year. I probably made the expenses too high. But we can split this out, and we can view profitability by overall profitability by the store and any other dimension that we wish to view it by, based on a sales driver. So that was a detailed example of performing an allocation in Power BI. In this case, an allocation of expenses using sales as a driver to allocate the expenses to lower grains. I hope that was useful. As always in Power BI, there's always multiple ways to achieve the same result. Do comment below if you do something different. It'll be very interesting to see how other people approach the problem. So Finance Free, we help finance teams to automate and improve their reporting and controls. Do get it free. You're free to get in touch if you'd like to talk to us about any projects that we may be able to help you with. And hope to see you soon on our next video. Thanks very much.